All right, so we are diving deep into some fascinating, I would say, ancient legal texts.
Yeah, very much so.
Specifically, we're looking at stuff from the book of Exodus.
Right.
Chapter 21.
Excerpts from Exodus 21. We're going to kind of immerse ourselves in some of these laws. And think of it as like stepping back in time and taking a peek at how an entirely different society dealt with like the big issues, that we still grapple with today.
Right. And the goal is not to judge these laws by like our own modern standards, but rather to kind of like
just to understand,
extract key principles and specific examples and to see, how they kind of approached things like servitude, personal injury, even just like, livestock
everyday
causing damage. Yeah,
absolutely. So
why don't we go ahead and unpack this, and maybe let's start with this whole idea of servitude.
Yeah. So the opening verses of Exodus 21 lay out the rules for Hebrew servants.
Okay.
And one of the first things you notice is that there's this kind of built-in limit on the length of service, right? 6 years. And then poof, you are free to go with no further obligation.
It's almost like a cycle. It
is a cycle.
Like you come in, you do 6 years, and you're out.
Yeah.
But there are some nuances right away.
Immediately, yeah.
Like if a male servant comes in alone, he leaves alone.
Exactly.
If he was married before he become a servant, then his wife leaves with him.
Right, so that's the initial picture.
Okay.
But then verse 4 introduces a little wrinkle, a little alteration to the situation.
Okay.
If the master provided the servant with a wife during his 6-year term, and they have children together, then at the end of the 6 years, only the original servant is freed.
Oh, wow.
The wife and the children remain the master's property.
Okay, so that's...
So it creates this distinction.
Within the family unit, what we would consider the immediate family.
Right.
It's kind of split legally.
Yeah, and that really kind of shows you like a very different way of thinking about like family bonds and like what is property and what isn't. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this idea of property is really key here.
Yeah, and then you get to this this really, I think, interesting part in verses 5 and 6.
Yeah.
Where a servant can actually choose to remain with his master.
Yes, so this is like a voluntary, lifelong commitment to servitude, right?
So they could just be like...
If he declares his, affection for his master, his wife, his children, and wishes to stay.
Wow.
Then there's this whole ritual that happens.
Okay.
He's brought to the judges, led to the door, or the doorpost.
Right.
And his ear is pierced with an awl.
Okay.
And this act signifies that permanent bond.
Wow, so it's like...
And it really underscores that this continued servitude was according to the law.
Right.
The servant's own choice.
Right, so it wasn't like they were...
Right, there's no coercion.
Being forced to stick. But, it does kind of make you wonder, like...
Yeah, well, and it reflects, I think...
What the alternative was.
The limited social mobility.
Right.
And the powerful bonds of the parency that existed within that society.
Right.
So you have to wonder, what were the alternatives available?
Right. Was this really a choice?
Was it truly a free choice?
Yeah. That image of the pierced ear is...
It's a powerful image.
It's a powerful image.
Very much so.
Now let's move on to this whole idea of the sale of a daughter as a servant.
Okay.
Which is in verses 7 through 11.
All right.
And here we see like a really different set of rules.
Yeah. Very distinct from the male servants.
Than the male servants.
Yeah.
So for example, a daughter sold into servitude did not automatically gain freedom after 6 years.
Right. The focus shifts more toward her protection.
Okay.
And potential future prospects.
Interesting.
It's a different set of concerns.
So it seemed like there were conditions under which she could be, like, redeemed.
Yeah, redeemed.
If she didn't please the master who acquired her.
Right, exactly.
And then also, like, it's interesting that the master couldn't just, like, if he changed his mind about her, he couldn't just sell her to foreigners.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really important safeguard.
Yeah.
Against exploitation.
It is.
It's fascinating how the nuances here.
Yeah.
Like the idea that she could be redeemed if he changes his mind.
Right.
But he can't just sell her off.
Yeah.
Really speaks to their understanding of obligation and intent.
Yeah, and like the initial intent of like why you acquired her in the first place.
If he breaks faith after selecting her, then he can't just treat her as,
like a commodity.
A commodity to be resold.
Right, right.
And then it goes on to say that, like, if the master intended her for his son, then she is to be granted, like, the full rights
of a
daughter
within the household.
So there's a potential avenue.
Immigrated into the family.
Social immigration.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's still within the context of servitude.
It's interesting.
And then it goes even further and says that if the master takes another wife,
Right.
the original female servant is still entitled to food, clothing, and what it refers to as marital rights.
Marital rights, yeah. The text is very specific about these ongoing responsibilities. If any one of those three essential provisions is lacking, then the female servant is to be set free.
Wow.
With no requirement for payment or ransom.
So like her well-being.
Yeah, her fundamental well-being was a prerequisite.
Is paramount.
For her servitude.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And look at personal injuries.
Right.
Starting in verse 12. And the initial principle is very direct.
Yeah, just lays it out.
Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death.
So very clear declaration regarding the value of human life.
Right. But then the very next verse
introduces
a really critical distinction.
Right.
Unintentional killing.
Right.
So if the death wasn't premeditated, but God lets it happen, the person can actually flee to a designated place of refuge.
A sanctuary.
Yeah.
Yes.
And avoid the death penalty.
Right. So this is like manslaughter with a system in place
it's like
for seeking sanctuary.
It's like a built-in system for like...
Or mitigating circumstances.
Yeah. And it's striking that like you have this very absolute decree of like life for life.
Yeah.
But then immediately it's like...
But intent matters.
Intent matters.
Right.
So it's not just...
It's not black and white.
Black and white, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this contrasts with premeditated murder.
Right.
Where verse 14 makes it very clear that even if you run to the altar, you're not protected.
No protection. Yeah.
So they're really differentiating between like...
levels of responsibility, showing that they understood nuance.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then we see this principle applied to harming parents.
Right. So striking or cursing a father or a mother carries the death penalty.
That's huge.
Underscoring the profound respect
wow.
and authority given to parents in this society.
Wow.
Yeah.
And kidnapping, also punishable by death.
By death, yeah.
Whether the person was sold or was still held captive.
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
The act of depriving someone of their liberty is a capital offense in itself.
So they really valued freedom.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, when we look at non-fatal physical altercations in verses 18 and 19, we see a bit of a different approach.
Okay.
So if someone is injured by a stone or a fist, but they recover, the assailant isn't automatically punished beyond compensating the victim.
Interesting.
So we move from capital punishment to a system of restitution.
So it's like if you're not permanently injured.
Yeah, if there's no permanent.
And then it's like, okay, we'll work this out.
You work it out.
Yeah. But the person who inflicted the injury
had to cover
the
lost time and medical care until recovery. So the focus was on making the injured party whole again.
Now this part is interesting, and I'm curious to get your take on this.
Okay.
The laws concerning the beating of slaves in verses 20 and 21 present some ethically challenging questions for us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if a slave died immediately as a result of a beating with a rod, the owner was to be punished. However, if the slave recovered after a day or two, the owner faced no punishment. And the text explicitly states this.
The slave is their property.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to reconcile with modern sensibilities.
So it really just kind of hits you in the face with like the social hierarchy.
Slaves as property.
Yeah.
Really shape the legal framework.
Yeah, the value of life was perceived.
Yeah, influencing the degree of...
based on your standing.
...and ability for their treatment.
It's jarring to hear the slave is their property.
It is.
You know, as a justification.
Yeah.
Did this whole concept of slaves as property?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer definitively, but it certainly informed the legal framework.
Okay.
And we see this again in this scenario involving a fight that results in injury to a pregnant woman.
Okay.
In verses 22 through 25.
Okay.
So if the outcome is a premature birth, but no serious harm to the woman herself, a fine is imposed. The amount determined by her husband and the court. But if there is serious injury to the woman, then we see the principle of life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot burn, for burn wound, for wound bruise, for bruise.
Right, and this is the lex talionis?
Yeah, the law of retaliation.
The law of retaliation, yeah, and it seems harsh.
It seems harsh.
But, you know.
But many historians believe that this principle of an eye for an eye was actually a limitation on excessive retaliation.
Oh, wow.
It sets a boundary for acceptable recompense.
So it's like...
it's fascinating how even seemingly brutal laws could serve to regulate violence.
It was like, okay, this is the limit.
This is the limit.
This is as far as you can go.
Right.
And that's it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It's a principle of reciprocal justice.
Okay.
Where the punishment is directly proportional to the injury inflicted.
Right.
So it aimed to limit disproportionate revenge.
Yeah, by establishing this clear standard.
A standard.
Yeah, and this principle is further exemplified in verses 26 and 27.
Right.
Where if an owner caused the loss of a slave's eye or tooth
through a strike,
the
slave was to be set free.
Wow.
As compensation for the injury. So the loss of the slave's labor was offset by their freedom.
Wow, that's a very specific type of justice.
It is a very specific form of justice.
Okay, let's move on to damage caused by animals.
Right.
Starting with bulls.
Wolves.
In verse 28.
28.
And the initial rule regarding a bull that gores someone to death. Is that the bull is to be stoned. And its meat is not to be eaten.
Not to be eaten.
But the owner isn't held responsible.
Initially. But that changes.
It changes.
If the bull has a history of goring.
Okay.
Right.
So if it's a known problem.
And the owner has been warned.
Yeah.
But failed to keep it contained.
Right, and they didn't heed those warnings.
Right, so then in verse 29, if a bull with a known propensity for violence kills someone, and the owner was negligent in controlling it,
then they're liable.
Both the bull is stoned and the owner is subject to the death penalty.
Wow.
However, the text introduces a potential alternative.
Okay.
The owner could pay a ransom.
Okay.
To redeem their life.
So essentially it's like a...
It's a monetary compensation. Determined by the community. Or the victim's family.
So even in a case of negligence leading to death...
There was a possibility. Of financial compensation instead of capital punishment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And verse 31 clarifies that this law also applied...
if the bull gored a son or a daughter.
A son or a daughter.
Right.
Okay.
And then in verse 32, we have a specific case outlined for a bull goring a slave.
Okay, and what happens there?
In that instance, the owner of the bull was required to pay 30 shekels of silver
to the master.
To the slave's master.
Okay.
And the bull was still stoned.
So the bull is always stoned.
The bull is always stoned, but the liability shifts
based on
depending on the victim. And the circumstances.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how they have like a specific monetary value.
Right, there's a specific
attached to the life of a slave.
Monetary value assigned in this context.
Okay, and finally let's look at the laws pertaining to other forms of property damage.
Okay.
Starting with uncovered pits in verse 33.
Right, so if someone digs a pit or uncovers a pit and neglects to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in and dies, the person responsible for the pit was obligated to compensate the owner for the loss by paying for the animal.
Right.
And then they got to keep the dead animal.
Oh, so they pay for it.
It's a straightforward principle of liability for negligence.
Yeah, okay. And then we have this scenario of one bull injuring another in verse 35.
Yeah, so if one bull injures another and it dies, the owners were to sell the live bull and divide the proceeds from the sale and the carcass.
Okay.
Equally.
So they like split the...
They split the loss.
The loss and the profit.
Yeah. It's like shared loss in cases of accidental harm.
But again, if the bull that caused the injury had a known history of goring, and the owner didn't secure it properly,
then the liability shifts entirely.
Wow, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. We've gone deep.
We've gone deep into these regulations. Pertaining to all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Servitude, personal injury, and property damage.
It's remarkable the level of detail in these laws.
It is.
Addressing all these specific scenarios.
It's so specific and like it really gives you this glimpse into like
it does.
The social and economic realities.
Yeah, these laws weren't just abstract pronouncements. They were meant to provide a framework for resolving disputes and maintaining order within a very specific societal structure.
Thou shalt not. It's like, okay, here's the specific thing that happened.
Right, here's how we deal with it.
And here's how you deal with it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we consider these specific examples from Exodus 21, what insights do you draw about the values and priorities?
It's a fascinating question.
Of this ancient society.
Right. It really makes you think about how different their world was. And yet also how some of the core concerns about justice, responsibility, compensation, how they resonate in a way with our own.
And how they clash.
Yeah.
Something to think about.
It is.
For sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's our deep dive for today.
Deep dive complete.
Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.